Okay, by now you've heard the prior chapters on the peak cheap oil concept, and by now many of you are wondering how any of that could still be true given all the positive recent stories about shale oil and shale gas, many of which proclaim that peak oil is dead. The mainstream press has faithfully repeated every press and PR statement made by the shale producers. And if you simply followed the headlines, you might even believe this about the United States. It is soon going to be energy independent. Its oil production will surpass even Saudi Arabia, putting it in the #1 spot. And the U.S. will even be exporting oil again, just like the days of old. The only problem with this story is that it is misleading in some very important ways and entirely false in others. Let's start with the easiest myth to dispel. The concept of energy independence is enormously flawed because the various types of energy being lumped together in this argument are not interchangeable. When you hear of energy independence, what's being calculated is the entire energy consumption of the United States expressed in BTUs. So every BTU of coal, oil, natural gas, wind, solar, nuclear, and hydropower we consume is tossed into a single bucket and then measured. But coal cannot be used in a manufacturing process that uses natural gas, nor can wind or solar or hydropower be put into a vehicle's or airplane's fuel tank. Now here's an easy way to understand this. It's as if somebody asked you how many calories you had stored in your pantry, and you lumped together not just your food, but also the batteries in your flashlights and other home electronics. Those might have caloric energy equivalents, but you sure can't eat them. What the U.S. cares about, the same as any country, is will it be independent with respect to the types of energy it consumes? The U.S. is not now, nor will it ever be independent from foreign oil imports. At least not until or unless it finds a way to increase production by another 7 million barrels a day or decrease consumption by a similar amount or some combination of both. However, it should be noted that even using the most optimistic shale oil projections on record for the U.S. only provides an additional 3 million barrels per day, leaving a big fat gap of 4 million barrels a day. And even then, that gap will begin to widen after only a couple of years as the horrendous decline rates of the shale wells kick in. Now we're going to talk about that in depth here. You might also be surprised to learn that the U.S. is still, here in early 2014, even a net importer of natural gas. Now it's true for natural gas, it's far more likely that the U.S. could become independent, and may even produce enough to support exporting natural gas, for a while at least, until that too depletes in a hurry. Regarding the U.S. becoming a net exporting oil powerhouse akin to Saudi Arabia, which exports roughly 8 million barrels per day, this could only be true for a very temporary period of time because each shale well produces a very little oil relative to a past conventional well, and then it depletes extremely rapidly. Literally, the best month of production for a shale well is the first month, by far. Things very rapidly go downhill from there. The typical shale oil well depletes by some 70% in the first year alone. Wow! And is down by some 80 to 90% after just 3 years. Because individual shale wells have these decline profiles, many of them summed together end up having the same profile. That is, to increase production in a shale field requires that constantly more new wells are drilled this year than last year, just to outrun the decline profiles of the prior wells. Something oil analyst Rune Livkern coined the Red Queen syndrome, after the Alice in Wonderland queen who remarked that you have to run faster and faster just to stay in place. Here's what the output from the Bakken shale oil field would look like if we suddenly stopped drilling. Where the mainstream press only notes the dark line on the top of the data, the steadily increasing production from the Bakken field, what's obscured underneath is the Red Queen syndrome that requires more and more and more wells to be brought online at a furious pace to keep that production rising. But here's the rub. It's not possible to always be drilling more wells this year than last. There are only so many drill rigs, talent, and so much fracking water available. So there's a bottleneck limit in there somewhere, and eventually there are only so many drill sites, and so those run out someday too. Once a shale play is all drilled up, it's game over, and all that happens next is a pretty steep production decline. But the most important point about shale plays is that they are expensive plays. And shale oil will always be expensive oil. And here's why. Shale wells are more accurately called tight rock wells because they might be in shale or limestone or even sandstone, but each rock type shares the characteristic of having really incredibly tiny pores that do not allow the oil and gas to flow easily. So the rock is referred to as tight. So when you hear of a shale play, the rock that's being drilled into is really quite similar to the slate used to make chalkboards in a classroom. Imagine trying to suck water through that chalkboard and you get the problem. It's pretty much impossible. So, if your classroom chalkboard were made of the same rock found in a shale oil play, the only oil you could reasonably get from it would be the oil you could squeegee off of the surface. The purpose of fracking is to shatter that chalkboard, which creates a lot of tiny pieces, which hugely increases the surface area from which oil and gas can be liberated from the tight rock matrix and flow easily into the wellbore for collection. Now, as you can easily imagine, that trick wears off rather quickly as you get the most in the first few instants after the chalkboard has been shattered. And this explains why the first flows after fracking are the best, and why production drops off precipitously after that. In the good old days, we might have drilled down 1,000 feet, hit a gusher, and then had a well that can produce thousands of barrels per day for the next 20 to 50 years. And now? With shale plays, the typical well goes down about 10,000 feet, turns sideways for another 10,000 feet, and then gets fracked in 20 or more stages to fracture the tight rock formations so that gas and or oil can flow. Clearly, we can already detect that far more money and energy is required to drill and multi-stage frack a 20,000-foot well versus a 1,000-foot well that required no fracking. A shale well typically costs between $7 and $10 million to drill, and just think of all the steel piping and diesel required to run the rigs that drill the 3 to 4 mile long wells. So shale wells can only possibly deliver to us more expensive oil than in the past, but as you now know, and most critically, that's the same thing as saying shale wells deliver far less net energy than conventional wells of the past. The environmental costs of the shale plays are really high. First, there's the footprint of the drilling pads and the collection pits to consider. Each drilled section requires a drill pad of anywhere from 1 to 2 or even 10 acres to be scraped flat. Seen from the air, the impacts are obvious. And then there's the fracking fluid itself. Mixed with millions of gallons of water, this stuff is a downright toxic nightmare. While we don't know everything it contains, because the exact concoctions are protected trade secrets due to the so-called Halliburton Amendment that specifically protects the oil and gas industry from having to reveal anything about what all is in there, we do know that it usually contains things like benzene and toluene and other highly toxic chemicals. Even if the drilling is done right and no fracking fluid ever gets into the water table, the fracking process involves first injecting this soup down into the ground and then collecting all of the flow back into an open-air pond before oil or gas collection begins. Now at this point, anything and everything in the fracking water, which includes the fracking fluid, heavy metals, and radioactive compounds like radium that have been liberated from the depths, are free to evaporate and or aerosolize and drift with the wind. And much of it does, creating enormous health issues for people and animals living downwind. Further, there are now over 2,000 complaints about damaged water wells, which, sadly, will probably remain compromised for many generations to come. Now, speaking of water, shale plays require an extraordinary amount of it, and in places where water is in short supply, shale wells compete vigorously for this scarce commodity. Yet another impact of shale plays is that because the drilling is so intensive, and the fracking requires so much material to complete, upwards of 1,200 fully laden heavy-duty trucks arrive and then leave each well site just to get that well into production. And then a further 350 trucks rumble across the roads for each year of operation for each well. And then another 1,000 trucks are required if or when a well gets refracked. All these heavy trucks crush roads and destroy bridges, and the repair costs for these damages are not even remotely covered by current taxes and other remittances made by the oil and gas industry. In Texas, the Department of Transportation estimated that $4 billion of road damage is done by oil and gas trucks each year. The state and the affected counties are the ones that have to bear the costs of repairing the damage, which are vastly higher than the taxes they collect from the oil and gas industry. So again, the taxpayers and local citizens are the ones that subsidize the full cost of these activities. The key point here is that, yes, tight oil is much more expensive than conventional oil, but its full costs are likely even much higher than what's appreciated today. The current story about the shale revolution is that technology unlocked those shale play riches, but that's not at all accurate. In fact, it's a myth. The twin technologies of horizontal drilling and fracking have both been around for many decades, and yet the shale plays just sat there untouched for all those decades. So what did unlock the shale riches? Price. Specifically, energy prices above a certain threshold. Horizontal drilling and fracking are very expensive. The amount of oil flowing from the shale wells is low. The only way to make that equation balance economically is if oil is safely above a certain price. It is no coincidence that shale drilling began in earnest once oil rose over $80 a barrel and stayed there. Below $80 a barrel, and the drilling will slow down enormously, or maybe even cease entirely. Above 80, and the best parts of the best shale plays are economically viable. The whole story here is that the shale plays were unlocked by price, not some magical technological breakthrough all by itself. Conversely, the shale plays could just as easily be locked in again by price too, if the price of oil or gas were to fall below the all-in drilling and production costs. Of course, we might be tempted to think that because we've only drilled intensively in 6 out of 20 potential shale plays, that there's a lot of runway left to this story. While there is quite a bit of drilling left to be done in each of these 6 plays, the remaining plays are, unsurprisingly, not nearly as attractive as the first ones. Why unsurprising? Because we've been drilling into and through these tight source rock formations for decades, and those with the most tantalizingly high petroleum and gas profiles were carefully cataloged by interested parties. When the price of oil and gas rose enough to justify making a go at these plays, the very best ones were gone after first. Now, this is not to say the remaining ones are not worth going after, only that it would be inappropriate to linearly extrapolate the early returns from the first 6 across the remaining 14. The remaining less attractive shale plays will come into full production in the future when the price of oil hits some other, much higher number, as their net energy returns are much lower. Okay, so what if the first shale gas plays are already in decline? Perhaps we can just move over one shale field and drill up the equivalent of another Barnett or Haynesville, and thereby grant ourselves a few decades before the story runs dry. Already exploration has been robust in the remaining 14 plays. Unfortunately, the early returns from those later shale plays are not at all encouraging. The Utica Shale in Ohio, once billed as $500 billion worth of fossil energy, has turned out to be pretty much of a complete bust, with individual wells pumping out less than 100 barrels per day on average in their highest month. The rock is simply too tight and will not yield economical energy until and unless oil increases in price several-fold from here, in current dollar terms, of course. And the Mississippian Formation under Kansas was extensively explored by Shell, which ended up completely throwing in the towel on that shale play in September of 2013 after disappointing yields were obtained from all 45 completed wells. The Monterey Shale in California, long billed as a huge potential source of oil and gas, is turning out to be very tricky for what I think are pretty obvious reasons. California has been extensively folded and bent and shaken and cracked by earthquakes, which creates the sort of tricky underground geological realities that prevent the story of easy drilling in the Bakken in North Dakota and the Permian in Texas. Those geologically unmolested plays are really more akin to plumbing operations, where pretty much any wellbore put down in a sweet spot will yield predictable results. But not in the twisted, folded, bent, and fault-ridden Monterey. There, each hole will be an exciting experiment with plenty of financial and operational, if not environmental risks, involved because the nature of the shale varies enormously from spot to spot. Which is why it was little surprise to me when in May of 2014, the EIA downgraded its estimate of the technically recoverable oil from the Monterey Shale. But even I was surprised by the amount. 96%. Yes, you heard that right. 96%, from 3.7 billion recoverable barrels down to just 600 million. Now, prior to this revision, the Monterey was estimated to be the United States' #1 reserve of shale oil in terms of size. This is a great example of how quickly the hype swirling around the shale oil story can disappear once the actual drilling results start coming in. Now, outside of the United States, Romania was profoundly disappointed when its estimated 1.4 trillion cubic meters of natural gas turned out to be a big, fat zero. And in Poland, what was estimated to be 5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas has since been slashed to just 768 billion cubic meters. In India, the first estimate of 63 trillion cubic feet of gas has now been slashed by 90% to 6.1 trillion cubic feet. Back to the United States, I expect other disappointments like these to be announced in the future as drillers move on from the best plays like the Bakken and Eagle Ford to the other less tapped plays still on the map. But it's also no surprise that the very best shale plays were drilled first. It's not like these shale plays were suddenly stumbled upon only recently. Petroleum engineers have been drilling through them and into them literally for decades in their search for conventional oil. And along the way, the petroleum-rich rocks were carefully noted and cataloged, and therefore well known, which is why the best plays were tapped first. But even within a given shale play, there are predictably enough sweet spots and less than sweet spots. Typically, the sweet spots are the places you read about in the newspaper when a superior well is drilled. The resulting headlines invariably imply that the whole play will be that tasty. All you need to do is multiply the total acreage by the very best results, and voila! North Dakota alone will rival Saudi Arabia. Alas, things are not that simple or abundant. Each well located in each spot can either be a monster, an average well, or even a complete dud. The ones that are usually reported on in the news are the monsters, as these are the ones that the involved companies are most proud of, for good reasons. However, when David Hughes plotted out all of the producing wells from the Bakken play, recording their highest and very best month of production, he got this shape of a curve. Very few of the wells produced out at the often reported 1,000 barrels per day, and the actual mean was 400 barrels per day, while the median, the number at which precisely 50% of the wells were either higher or lower than, was only 341 barrels per day. As you can see, there are very few monster wells in the play, with those recording over 1,000 barrels per day being roughly 2 or 3 out of every 100. Hughes also plotted out all of the producing wells on a satellite map and color-coded them. Those that are in the upper 20% of initial monthly production, at just over 500 barrels a day, are black dots, while the remaining 80% are red dots. What is immediately and obviously clear here are the sweet spots with their tight clusters and galaxy spiral arms tracing out the underground complexity. What should also be immediately clear is that the chances that the remaining acreage are going to be as sweet as the initial acreage are not very high. Any monster well is immediately noted by all the other players, and they tend to finish up their current well and hustle over to the same region as soon as they can, assuming they have applicable acreage to drill. That is, the sweet spots get identified very quickly and drilled up as rapidly as possible. After all, time is money, and the point here is to make money as fast as possible, not preserve a resource for future generations. The same sorts of results are being found at each and every shale play. Some areas are sweet, and the wells are great. Other areas, not so great, and the differences are discovered one well at a time. Or, as Arthur Berman, the energy analyst, put it perfectly, the sweet spots are discovered by the Braille method. The summary here is that within each shale play, there is tremendous variability in terms of individual well productivity, and that those sweet spots get rapidly located and focused upon, saving the less sweet spots for later on. Again, the big mistake one could make here would be to take the first few years of production for a given play and then just multiply that out across the remaining acreage, because it's extremely unlikely that the remaining acreage is going to be nearly as sweet as that was already drilled. Well, that exact mistake is repeated with exceptional frequency in the mainstream press, unfortunately. What will make the remaining acreage more attractive is the same thing that made the shale plays happen in the first place: higher energy prices. Besides the obvious environmental and infrastructure impacts of shale oil and gas, there's a real puzzle on the economic side too. If these plays are so robust, so predictable, And such a great thing. The companies involved should be cranking out money from operations. The way this is measured in accounting terms is by a measure called free cash flow. Every business major and MBA student has to understand this measure because it's a really powerful and easy way to tell if a company is really generating robust profits and whether or not its investments are likely to produce future free cash flows. Here's where the story gets really odd for the companies involved in the shale plays. They are collectively bleeding cash and sport deeply negative free cash flows. In fact, in 2012, the 80 largest North American energy companies spent $50 billion more than they took in from operations, a deficit that was twice as high as in 2011 and 4 times larger than in 2010. The current statistic is that the shale operators are spending $1.50 in capital drilling wells, but only getting $1 in revenue for their troubles. This is really quite a conundrum, given that we are this many years into the story of the so-called shale miracle. Cash flows really ought to be heavily positive by now, and they are decidedly negative. It's a mystery. The only interpretation of this puzzle that makes sense to me is that shale plays are really not profitable at the current oil price of $100 a barrel. My best guess is that oil will have to rise to at least $120 a barrel for the equation to balance out at the level of the operating companies, but in reality will likely need to be closer to $150 a barrel to pay for all the externalities that are currently under or even unfunded, such as road and bridge damage and the eventual costs of plugging hundreds of thousands of abandoned wells. Here we are, deep into the story of shale oil, and we find that the basic trend is for the companies involved to be spending increasingly more than they are taking in year after year. Now that's a huge red warning flag for me. It means that something is not quite right here economically yet. And if Wall Street hadn't been flooded with multi-generationally cheap Fed-supplied liquidity in historic proportions, which Wall Street funneled towards anything that looked remotely interesting, I seriously doubt nearly as much oil drilling activity would have occurred in the shale plays. Eventually, though, these companies should be able to settle down, not drill any more expensive wells, and rake in the cash from existing, but obviously declining, production. However, at that point, while the companies should be minting money, the energy miracle will be well and truly over for the United States, as no more new incremental production will be coming out of the ground, and oil and gas production will enter a rapid and terminal decline. That is, the eventual peak in oil and gas production from the shale plays is a lot closer than most people think. Perhaps there will be additional surprises in this story, but for now, the EIA thinks that the peak in production from the U.S. shale plays will occur around 2021, with steady erosion in production thereafter. That is, here in 2014, we are just 7 years away from the shale miracle turning from a princess into a pumpkin. But even there, I have to question the assumptions of the EIA because of this image found in their 2014 Annual Energy Outlook. Somehow, over the 28 years between 2012 and 2040, all of the conventional plays in the U.S. are going to experience exactly 0 production declines, despite the fact that over the past 28 years, they experienced an average yearly decline rate of 2.3%. Now, holding that experience constant, 28 years into the future, there would be just 2.3 million barrels per day coming from conventional sources in the U.S. versus the stated 4.0, and that's a big, big difference. And another real puzzler is the tight oil in the red at the top of the chart. Again, courtesy of David Hughes, we see that there's something odd going on there. Somehow by 2015, oil from shale plays besides the Bakken and the Eagle Ford will exceed those 2 plays, which are by far the best out of the lot. It's just not at all clear to me yet which remaining shale plays the EIA projects are going to supply that additional oil, or nearly that fast, as communities and states wake up to the fact that there are both environmental and infrastructure concerns that need to be better addressed and even priced in. And after 2021, the EIA projects that tight oil will decline very, very gently, which is an interesting prediction. Okay, so here are the 5 main things to know about shale plays. Number 1, they deplete very quickly. The typical shale, or tight rock well, declines in production by 80% to 90% within just 3 years. Number 2, they are expensive wells. All oil and gas coming from them is several times more expensive than what we got from conventional plays in the past. Number 3, they are environmentally damaging because the fracking fluid is highly toxic and much of it escapes during the blowback process, and sometimes water wells are contaminated. Number 4, because each well has low flow and depletes quickly, massive numbers of wells must be drilled, creating significant infrastructure damage to roads and bridges. Currently, no state or municipal authorities are capturing anything close to the total cost of the infrastructure damage from the shale operators, which means taxpayers are paying those bills. And finally, number 5, not all shale plays are created equally. Some are vastly superior to others. And even within a given play, there are sweet spots and dry holes, which can only be determined by punching a well in and seeing what comes out. Some call this the mapping by Braille approach. Now, when we put all of these together, it adds up to a very expensive set of plays that will only last for a very short while. To the extent that mainstream press has been conveying the message that peak oil is dead and that our energy concerns have been laid to rest is the extent to which they have been misleading us. Sadly, many of the articles I've read in the press about the so-called shale miracle read very much like they've been lifted directly from shale industry public relations collateral. Indeed, some probably were. The context is both relevant and essential, and it's only now just beginning to creep into a few mainstream press articles. In closing, the shale plays are really a feat of engineering, and they have bought us some time. We can either use the temporary boost in energy supplies, expensive though they are, to build towards a future when these too eventually run out, or we can use them as an excuse to carry on with business as usual. If we do choose business as usual as our operating strategy, and I'm using that word very loosely, then we will just march straight into the shale oil peak around the year 2021 and be very disappointed with ourselves and our utterly inappropriate transportation infrastructure. Thank you for listening.